Okay. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. And I'd like to welcome you to the Green Roads webinar series, in which we discuss cross-cutting dimensions of ADB's Green Roads Toolkit, including decarbonisation, climate resilience, water management, biodiversity, disaster risk reduction, construction materials, and inclusive growth for developing green roads. All of our webinars are anchored in ADB's Green Roads Toolkit and assessment tool. And all of our past webinars and presentations are uploaded to the Development Asia website for Green Roads webinars. And we will share the link to this in the chat box. So don't worry, anything you've missed in the past or anything you might miss today, you can always go back and watch again. Now, you may know that the Green Roads Toolkit integrates gender equality as a core dimension, ensuring that transport solutions are inclusive and responsive to the needs of women and other marginalized groups. So for today's webinar, we are really excited to support the launch of ADB's Gender Equality in Transport Microsite. We've got some fantastic speakers today, and I know you want to hear from them. But before we get started, I need to go through the house rules. So please keep your microphones muted at all times. Please place any questions that you might have in the Q&A box at any time through the presentations, and we will address these during the Q&A session after the presentations. So moving to today's webinar, we will hear from 3 speakers. First, we will have opening remarks from Chen Chen, who is the Director for Central West East Asia and the Pacific in the Transport Sector Office. Next, we will hear from Samantha Hung, Director of Gender Equality Division at ADB. And she has been championing gender responsive development across all of ADB's regions and initiated ADB's work on Gender and Transport Toolkit back in 2014. So today we're quite excited to hear more about how this important initiative has progressed over time. And in particular, we're going to see this in action through an interactive demonstration of the new microsite from Claire Sharamnak. Claire is a social development specialist of gender and development here at the Asian Development Bank, and she's one of the transport sector focals working to advance gender equality in transport initiatives. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Director Chen Chen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Beck, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Green Roads webinar series. I'm very excited to be here with you for the launch of ADB's Gender Equity in Transport Microsite. So this is a very important enrichment for ADB's transport sector's instrument to help us to commit to the transport system, which should be more inclusive, safer, and more sustainable. So transport sector traditionally has been perceived as an engineering sector, but we know it's not only about engineering. So women and girls face distinct mobility challenges, safety concerns, time poverty, and limited access to economic opportunities. These barriers affect not only individual lives, but also economic growth and social equity. Consider these facts we are facing. So Asia and the Pacific account for 61% of global transport workforce, about 150 million people, or 7% of all employment in the region. Yet, women represent only 14% of the transport workforce, and just 2.6% of women in Asia's formal economic work in transport. Before 2015, female employment in Asia's transport sector grew at 2% annually. Since the adoption of the SDGs, the pace has slowed to 1.3%. falling behind the global average. These trends vary across countries, but shaped by different policy environment. The momentum for change is missing. Under ADB's Strategy 2030, we commit that at least 60% of operations will promote gender equity by 2030. Transport is one of ADB's largest sector and a critical driver for achieving SDGs and building an inclusive future. The Gender Equality Toolkit under the microsite will help us integrate gender-responsive actions into projects, TAs, and to deliver transformative outcomes. The microsite that will be presented shortly is not just a resource. It's a practical enabler for change. By the way, I just tried it before this seminar. I can assure you it's very user-friendly. It empowers project teams, policymakers, and development partners to move beyond compliance towards transformative and impactful gender outcomes. Whether you are designing a rural road, an urban transit system, or a regional corridor, this microsite can help to ensure that women's voice and needs are reflected in every decision. The stakes are still high. The region needs to address the huge transport infrastructure. As an example, the Asian Transport Observatory projects that the region will need to build another 8 million kilometers of new roads by 2030. And yet, road transport already accounts for 40% of the global emission from roads. At the same time, women make up only 14% of the transport workforce. If we don't act now, we risk locking in inequity for decades to come. Today's launch is another step towards changing that trajectory. We need to work towards making gender equality a core part of sustainable transport, not an afterthought, not an ad hoc action. By combining insights from tools such as this microsite and the Green Roads Toolkit, amongst others, we can design transport systems that are not only green, resilient, but also inclusive and empowering and for all and serving the whole community. So colleagues, I invite you to explore this microsite, share your feedback, and use it in your projects. So together, let's make gender equality and sustainability a reality in every transport operations. Finally, I want to just mention, I'm sure Sam and our gender team has made a lot of effort, but from transport sector, I saw actually two names contributed to this toolkit. So Bertrand and Kirsty. So they were all part of the peer reviewers. Thank you, and thank you for these excellent products. Over, back to you. Back.
Thank you, Director Chen Chen. We'd now like to hear from Director Sam. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Bex, and greetings to everyone on the call, wherever you may be in the world. So my colleague Chen Chen already very eloquently talked about the importance of this toolkit, and so I'm coming you from the perspective of the Gender Equality Division, which I lead. But I'd just like to start by saying I think this has been a very good example of strong collaboration between the Gender Equality Division and our transport sector colleagues to really develop something that was mutually beneficial and really serving the needs of our sector operations. So from our perspective, the Gender Equality Division, we're very excited to launch this microsite because it's a bit of a new way of presenting things. As Bex mentioned earlier, we had our existing gender equality in transport guide that was published in 2014. And at that time, we were learning how to mainstream gender equality into our transport sector operations. So this new microsite and toolkit that accompanies it is really to lift, to have a resource which really supports the lifted ambition, because obviously the sector has evolved, and really help support the transport ecosystem and the stakeholders in that ecosystem, whether it be our own staff, partner multilateral development banks, other development finance institutions, our developing member countries, the private sector, and just transport and gender specialists, or et cetera, to really understand opportunities to raise ambition and go beyond the standard mainstreaming approaches to date and begin integrating more ambitious and transformative agenda for gender equality in transport sector initiatives that focus on issues such as women's mobility, safety, employment, leadership, etc. I think Chen already very much described the infrastructure deficit that the Asia and the Pacific region currently has. He also talked about how significant the transport sector is to the region, for a whole range of development objectives, whether it be the actual infrastructure, but the social and economic benefits that it brings. And so therefore, this sector really presents an opportunity to build inclusive systems and actually promote gender equality through the sector. And so that we actually have new and more transport systems that actually intentionally ensure that women and girls have access to markets, employment, health, education, and other benefits. So as an institution, ADB has been a long supporter of gender equality, and our intention is really to design projects and interventions and investments that accelerate gender equality by really understanding what the gender issues are. And we've been learning by doing really over the years. And some of the very key issues that come up, Chen already mentioned, but they are issues that limit mobility and actually act as a barrier to women's economic participation. There are things such as harassment of women and girls on public transport. I mean, there have been many surveys that show this is a real issue in the region as well as globally. Chen also mentioned about how women are not represented in a lot of the transport workforce. And I think if you break that down and look at the types of jobs, you also see even more stark gender patterns. So, to date, we've been learning, and so far, our transport projects have addressed on a few key gender issues. For example, how do we make transport infrastructure safer and more gender responsive, and through design? And as a result of that, how do we measure increased ridership and use of the transport infrastructure by women and men in comparison? And how does that then expand access to economic opportunities, use of health services and education? So that's sort of one big bucket. Another area is how do we actually design interventions that actually try to narrow the gender gap in employment that the transport infrastructure and the transport sector offers. And we say that particularly there are gaps in jobs which involve technical, managerial, and leadership positions. And so we're also trying to encourage moving women up the leadership in the transport sector through initiatives such as the Women in Transport Network, which we actually launched earlier this year alongside our partners, the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, Germany's GIZ and ITF, and we focused on Central and West Asia. So this kind of example of promoting women's participation through professional development network and best practices is an area where we see there's lots of opportunity going forward. So I'm not going to talk too long because I think we actually want to see the microsite, but really it's also an example of how we're trying to make the tools we develop more user-friendly and more practical. So it's intended to be interactive. It's intended to be designed in a way that you can tailor it depending on your particular purpose, whether you are a project team leader, agenda specialist, or just someone interested in the topic. So you can tailor it to explore that works for you. It deliberately includes guiding questions, prompts, and checklists so that you can drill down to recommended actions, even indicators and case study examples that you can apply to your own transport project. And more importantly, we hope that it will be a tool for dialogue and learning. I think the whole sector is learning, ADB included, and that's the whole purpose, so that we can have a platform for interaction and basically moving the needle forward and making gender equality in the transport sector practical, actionable, and transformative, and empowering stakeholders to be able to drive the real change in gender inclusive and responsive transport systems across the region that we're working towards. So with that, I will hand it back to you, Bex, and I think Claire will come in to actually demonstrate. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Sam. So now this is the most exciting part, and not that the opening remarks weren't fantastic, because they were, but now we get to get our hands dirty and have a look at the microsite and have a play around. So Claire, please, over to you.
Thank you, Beck, and thank you so much for these opening remarks from our directors, which highlight again the close collaboration between our two teams, which is so appreciated. And we are excited to show you the product of all this work, which was really a labor of love for, at least intensively 6 months, up to a year. And I want to thank our design firm, D3 Digital, and my team members, Mikey and Andrew, who helped me on this journey. We are just so excited to be able to launch this today. So I'm going to share my screen, and I hope that you're able to see this. And please just give me a thumbs up as soon as you can see this. Perfect. Thank you so much. So this link has also been dropped in the chat, and please walk through this with us, with me as we're going through this. It's going to be interactive, as Beck mentioned. I'm going to pull her in to ask her to walk through a real project that she is working on, because we want to show how interactive and hopefully useful this can be for your work, right? Why we wanted to do this was really to demystify the gender analysis, assessment, and planning process, right? This toolkit and microsite really wants to answer that question that we often get as gender specialists, which is, how do you integrate this into projects? How do you get started, right? And I think we wanted to make sure this was accessible for all, because sometimes, we have these gender assessments in our documents, or we have these reports that we publish, and it's very hard for this to then be used by everyone. And we want, whether it's transport specialists, gender specialists in governments, private sector companies, and development institutions, to be comfortable to learn how to integrate gender considerations into transport projects, because we know this is something that is critical for all of us to do, right? Not just gender specialists, but we all have, really should be doing this in our work. So I'm on the homepage for those who are following along with me. And really what we wanted to do, and Sam touched upon, was to say you're taking on a journey depending on your role. So whether you are on a transport project team, a gender specialist, you're an inclusive mobility advocate, or an everyday mover, and we really use this as everyone uses transportation, right? Whether you want to learn more about how gender inequality affects your mobility, design and manage a project, there's something for you in this toolkit. And so we wanted to make this as easy as possible, and frankly fun, for you to be able to go through this process and hopefully have a very easy PDF at the end of this that you can take and use for your work, right? So there are 5 steps that we use to apply this toolkit, right? And the first is really, where we start is identifying gender gaps in a transport project. We need to do that in order to be able to design good practice gender actions and gender performance indicators. And from there, we can determine what implementation modalities will be needed to implement these good practice gender actions and indicators. Of course, it is critical for us to monitor and evaluate our gender impacts, and to make sure that we are preventing and mitigating negative impacts and risks, such as gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. As we go through this whole process, we have about 36 case studies and counting, because I would love for you to please, and we'll flash a QR code at the end of my presentation, to please contribute your case studies to this, right? So we have ADB case studies. We also have case studies from our developing member country governments on policies, as well as from our partners. And we want to continue adding to this database. If you click on the case studies, I just want to quickly go through this to show you how you can filter through. You can filter through the case studies through the by region, by countries, by gender focus areas. So for example, if you're interested in learning more about specific case studies that focused on the collection of sex disaggregated data or on women's entrepreneurship. You can filter through that way, and also through the transport subsectors that we work in. I'm quickly just going to click on a case study so that you know what you get when you click on these, right? So you have a description of the project, and then there's a link so that you can learn more when you click on the title. So to get back to where we were on the homepage, as I mentioned, we will eventually be going through the actual journey, but of course we need to start a little bit with the why, right? And so why and how are women and girls different, travel needs different from men? What are the barriers they face? What are gender differences in travel behavior? So that's really our get started page, right? And what we wanted to have was a sort of visually easy way for you to see. And of course, it's not limited only to these, right? But what are some of the different travel characteristics between men and women across socioeconomic groups in Asia and the Pacific? We know, for example, that women travel differently in terms of distance, that they're impacted differently by cost, that their purpose of trip is often very different from men. So I'll just click on this to show you what this looks like. But we know that women are more likely to travel for care-related tasks, for example, due to their traditional role as primary caregivers. Often these trips, when we're collecting data, tends to be disguised. We call them shopping trips, education, health, and social purposes. But that really doesn't demonstrate how often women are traveling, for example, with dependents for these care-related tasks, whether that's bringing an older person to a healthcare center or bringing your child to your daycare center. These are not fully captured yet under the data that we have. Of course, there are other pieces of travel characteristics and data we wanted to highlight, including percentages related to road crash fatalities, women's lower ownership and use of personal vehicles. They're less likely to be able to own, to afford personal vehicles. They also are less likely to have the driving skills and the licenses, right, to be able to operate the personal vehicles. So please take the time to scroll through this on your own time. But all this helps inform and think through already. And what we hope this toolkit can be used for is really at the brainstorming stage, right? So when you are at the beginning of, say, designing your project and thinking through, okay, we know that there are some of these very clear gender differences that already exist. And then we, of course, want to further drill down into the project context and the country that you're working in. And the guiding questions that I will walk through with Beck will kind of show you how you can think about that. But before you dive into that detail, the other, the three kind of pillars we wanted to highlight were this issue of differences in mobility, safety, and employment. And so I'm coming now onto safety to talk a little bit about which I think everyone is on this call is very aware of the high levels of harassment of women and girls on public transport. We know that this is a major problem in our region and globally, and that women's participation and economic, education, and social activities is affected by this, right? And in some societies, there's also a low acceptance of women traveling alone. It's important to keep in mind and to consider that women with disabilities experience violence at 2 to 3 times the rate of women without disabilities, and that we need to consider this when planning and designing transport services. And so I just want to highlight that if you click on the More Info tab here, we'll get to this at the end, that there's a Contact Us section, which we highly encourage you to do. But there's also a Tools section, and that leads you to a library of resources, including a gender equality and disability inclusion guideline that we developed last year, which has amongst its focus on multiple sectors, that has one on transport that's very useful to think about how we design and plan transport services to address the needs of women with disabilities. So as you go through, you'll note that we have by region, data that we could find that was available. We tried to keep it fairly recent in the last 5 years. Of course, for some countries, the data is much older. Again, I take this opportunity to really ask and say, it is hard to find this data. So we hope to use this as a repository for this data. If you have this data for your country, please do, let us know, send it in so we can update and make sure this is as accurate as possible. We did the same thing and wanted to highlight employment. Women constitute only 12% of all jobs in the transport and storage sector globally. That's actually lower for our region, for Asia and the Pacific. And again, this varies a lot depending on the region that you're working in, but you can click through and see where we have available data and for which specific countries that we currently have data. So it's important as I talk about those building blocks not to neglect the fact that we know that transport systems are vulnerable to climate change and that this disproportionately affects women. This is due to the fact that women use slower modes of transport, are more likely to use shared modes of transport like public transport, and that makes them more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Extreme heat and heat stress also make travel more physically demanding, and especially for specific groups of women like pregnant women, for example. So again, if you go to our tool, our library of resources, you will find a link to the climate change, gender equality and climate change sectors guide, in which we cover the transport sector and how this interaction of gender equality and climate change is so important to consider when designing transport projects. So I am about to get us onto the journey of actually going through the toolkit, but I wanted to, before going into that, just really highlight that a lack of quantitative and qualitative sex disaggregated data makes it very difficult for us to do these gender analyses and to assess gender differences and inequalities. And that's why this microsite is really a step in that direction of trying to have a baseline and understanding of the data that currently exists, the case studies that we can point to of best practices, and be able to give you guiding questions as you go through this whole process. Collecting this data is so important because it helps inform gender transformative policies, infrastructures, and services. And so it's things like, being able to have trip routes and schedules informed by women's travel needs. So we see this very much as a living document. Of course, it's interactive. It's for this purpose. That's why we wanted to bring it out of the PDF so that we can be updating this with the latest data and the information that you hopefully will share with us. So I will ask Beck if she does not mind to join me as we go on this journey together. And I encourage all of you on this call, please, click on this, go on the site, go to Explore by Role and pick where you fit on this. You could be multiple, that's fine. Pick the one that resonates the most in terms of your role right now. And we will walk through this together, and you will also be thinking through these guiding questions together, hopefully, so that also we can answer any questions you might have as you're walking through it. So Beck is on a transport project. I know this. So we're going to apply the toolkit that way. So you'll notice that there are steps here on the left. And the first step is really designing. There's a step 1 here, and that is really for gender analysis, which is done generally by gender specialists, right? And so since we're taking it from the perspective of a transport specialist, we wanted to start at the step that they're most likely to come in at, right? And so this is thinking about, of course, the gender gaps, which the previous pages would have started informing you about and that you would go through, but then also thinking about what are outcome level targets, and they could be also output level, that are relevant to your project, right? So is it the utilization of transport infrastructure? And you can click more than one for your project. Is it increased representation of women in technical leadership roles, improved outcomes for women, which includes, for example, increase in women-owned businesses, right? Or contracts awarded to women-owned businesses, improved travel outcomes. So that's looking at the reduction of women's travel time and increased access to services. And this final piece of, increased access to, for example, health services, education, et cetera. So Beck, I'll ask you what you think is most relevant to your project.
Yeah, so I'll just give a quick 30-second overview of the project that we're working on at the moment. So it's an electrification of buses in one of our developing member countries. We're working with a bus operator, which also happens to be a state-owned enterprise. And we're working with them both to improve their depot infrastructure, their actual buses and their bus fleet, as well as their human resources practices, noting that there is a significant gap in the workforce in terms of female representation. So I would say utilization of transport infrastructure and women in technical leadership roles are great ones to start with for this project.
Okay, great. And so these will be saved, and at the end of it, you will get a PDF that sort of recaps everything that we go through now. But I just wanted to also encourage, when you click on these, to look at what are some examples of indicators, that, that when you think of utilization of transport infrastructure would be, for example, the increase in ridership of women. What we've tried to do is to have case studies that could be relevant and inspiring, that have some best practices that, will be useful for your project. So I'm just highlighting that for you to explore later, but we can continue on to step 2B. Now, from there, of course, there are some foundational gender actions that we would want to include that would contribute to closing gender gaps and promoting women's empowerment, right? And so we have here some, and again, some and all could be, of course, we're not going to go through all of them now, could be relevant to your project, right? So whether it's sex disaggregated data, institutional policy, legislative and regulatory environment, physical infrastructure, operations, services. If you're looking and working with transport agencies and ministries, what is their organizational structure and capacity? Women's entrepreneurship, of course, that is both in the projects we do on the sovereign side, but also private sector. And what is critical and kind of a bedrock across, I think we could definitely say across all transport projects, is really looking at how we can have survivor-centered prevention of and response to gender-based violence in transportation systems. So, Beck, what would you say would be most relevant for your project?
For this project, yeah, actually, we're hitting on almost all of these, but I think the key ones to highlight would be institutional policy, and then also the survivor-centered prevention. So yeah, the SIA as well, and of course physical infrastructure, which is where I suppose most of my transport colleagues might be most comfortable is our more traditional project approach. But yeah, they're all relevant here.
And I just want to point out that when you click on those, there are further sort of recommended actions and case studies. So for urban public transport, we would often think about, conducting gender and accessibility infrastructure audits, if that's possible, right? Looking at what are gender responsive first and last mile services. So this proposes some actions to be considered. Again, this is for brainstorming and thinking through and having discussions within your team. But you would want to go through all of these and see which of these parameters are apply, because as we know, it could be all, it could be one. And you had mentioned survivor-centered prevention of gender-based violence in transportation systems. So again, you can always click on these, look at what's recommended, and look at some of the case studies that we have that are related to this and how they applied this. So I will continue on to step 3. Of course, we need to consider, what are the financial and human resources that are required to implement all these gender actions, right? We have a few. Again, these are not, it's not exhaustive, so it's not all of them, right? And again, we would love to hear your feedback on some that we may have missed and you think should be added. But in the case of your project, Beck, what do you think is most applicable and most likely to be your implementation modality?
I think probably supporting the ministry to create gender responsive budgets, and maybe also the senior gender focal.
Yeah. And so again, this is a lot of times brainstorming, like, can we come and bring this and have these conversations? This gives us ideas, right, of things that we can discuss with the government or with the private sector partner. And, it's not always possible to do it all. Sometimes it's a bit of a wish list. Like, wouldn't it be great to be able to do all of this? But again, this is just to have some additional ideas. And often because I know, when we're speaking to governments and private sector clients, so we often get the question of where has this been done, or what are some good practices you can share with us, right? And so I think that what we're really trying to do is make this as accessible for you as possible to be able to have that list that you can click through and point to as examples. So we're now on step 4 of the best practices for monitoring and evaluating gender impacts. We know that most of the monitoring and evaluation we do is qualitative, right? It's very hard to get quantitative, whether it's baselines, and then also when we're doing end lines for impact evaluations. So we have some recommendations, again, in terms of, what are whether it's possible to conduct annual surveys, data user surveys that would assess user satisfaction. Interim assessments, of course, I think a lot of the work we do at ADB, and the regular quarterly reporting would fall under this bucket. And of course, is very critical to look at the progress of the measures you have in your gender action plan, right? And then, of course, where we are able to do it, end-line assessments are so important because they go over, what are the direct benefits, co-benefits, what are the wider impacts that you might have? And the end-line assessment is the most challenging often to do resource-wise. But again, these are some things we'd like to prompt the conversation and see what's possible. So, Beck, which one do you think would be most applicable and realistic for the project?
So I should have mentioned as well for mine, my project, it's a results-based lending project. So data is really important. Definitely we'll be doing interim assessments. So I think definitely interim and line.
Yeah.
We'll be doing both.
So step 5 are the negative impacts and risks. How can they be avoided or mitigated? We talk primarily, really for this is looking at sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and what are the principles that are really guiding the prevention, mitigation, response to SEA. This has been pulled from the good practice note. And again, please refer to the the library of resources that we have here for more of this information. We have activities that are generally recommended as part of the prevention and mitigation of SEA, which include training for staff and contractors, training for local communities, and a code of conduct. So I know that there are a few here that I think are relevant in this case, Beck, right, for your project.
Yeah, I think the one that is highlighted is probably the most relevant for this project, which is the code of conduct, because what we're trying to support is sustainable changes inside of the state-owned enterprise related to the prevention of SEA.
Yeah. Okay, so this is where you export your toolkit guide. And essentially, I mean, you would click on the button. In this case, I won't because I still want to show you a few things. And Beck, thank you for letting me use the example of your project for this. It will sum this all up basically for you. Everything that you clicked throughout the different steps, whether it's the indicators, the links to the case studies, the guiding questions and the actions that are recommended, so that you can start thinking through in one, so something that's very tailored to your project. In the conversations that you're having and of course drawing from the context project and context specific gender assessment you would be developing, what are some ideas? And we really want to be able to pull from existing good practice that we already have. I want to highlight one thing. So 2 things. One is that we link to the actual PDF. All of this content that was developed is based off the toolkit that we released a few months ago. And we understand that some people would prefer to use that version. And so we wanted to, of course, make sure that we had both versions available, right? The second piece that I wanted to highlight before we move to a Q&A is really that, as I said, this is a living and interactive document. We would love to hear from you, whether it's questions or suggestions that you have for case studies, or as you walked through user design even. We want this to be very helpful for you. So please let us know in terms of suggestions or ideas that you might have, and if you'd like to collaborate with us on this. I think we will be flashing, I'm going to stop sharing this. We will be flashing a QR code that will enable you to get back to this contact us form. But again, we have the link in the chat and you can just click on more and contact us and you'll be able to contact us that way. But we also really look forward to, in the next 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, hearing from you, questions you might have and suggestions you can have for making this as relevant as possible for your work.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Claire, for walking us through the site. And I can see we have quite an active question and answer box. And just reminder to anybody to please place your questions into that Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to them. So, okay, let's just go in order of submission. So there is a point, I suppose, raised that when you showed the toolkit, you showed crashes for one of the risks for women. Perhaps, Claire, if you don't mind, would you be able to bring that page back up again for us to see?
Absolutely. Give me one second.
And the comment is that, we know that road safety is a significant barrier for women's mobility. When we talk about vulnerable road users, we know that women fall into that bucket. In here at the moment, the statistic that we have is on fatalities, but the point in the chat box is that we should also be looking at serious injuries, and that there are a lot of global studies out there. Yeah, so the question is, would supporting research on digging into this on serious injuries side be a consideration for further development of the toolkit?
So this is already an excellent first question out of the gate. I love it. It's so helpful. And I completely agree with you. I mean, you could work on something for 6 months and you go, I cannot believe we didn't include, those impacts, which are you're absolutely correct on. Thank you for bringing up in terms of the differences we see for women as pedestrians. We know that they're more likely to use walking as their form of transport, right? Not non-motorized forms of transport. And that's not reflected in here, right? So absolutely, we will work to include that, and what we will have, refreshes to the website in terms of making sure we have the latest data and also information. So we'll make a note of that to be including that. And I agree with you on your greater point that we don't have enough studies on this. I think we're starting to make some progress in terms of the data collected, and that's actually one of the recommendations that we have if you go to the section on collection of sex segregated data, to say that, already the first step is good of being able to disaggregate for road crashes, but we have it for some countries and not others in terms of injuries versus fatalities. We have it less likely for pedestrian, fatality, and breaking that further down. And so I think it's important that we try to apply that into our projects as much as we can, but also that we look into it from the research perspective, as you said, not just the data collection, but studies that can really get into our understanding of the gender differences at play, the gender dynamics at play, and then what interventions we could put into place to address that. So point very well taken, and thank you. That's something we'll be working on in the next version of this in the next month or so.
Thanks, Claire. And yeah, and as Claire pointed out, we've got that contact us page, right? So please share all these ideas with us through there. So the next question, do we have urban or subnational level data and case studies included?
We do, yes, we do. So
Excellent.
I would advise you to go and take a look at the case studies, because we do. Short answer is yes.
Yeah. The next question that came up in the box is talking about the challenges around electric bikes in particular. This is very much another road safety point. So I think we can definitely add some more case studies in, and please send through your suggestions into that contact us form. But yeah, helmet use is a huge challenge, and we know that there's a lot of behavioral aspects, behavior change aspects, as well as the infrastructure safety side and enforcement side that need to come together for road safety to be effectively addressed. So if we move on to the next question here. Okay, so we are preparing a comprehensive tour of gender toolkit. We're preparing a workplace strategy for a road development agency in India under an ADB assignment. My question is, how do we refer to this toolkit to make our strategy more effective? That's a really good question.
Thank you. There's actually quite a bit of our case studies that link to this. I actually think a lot of our work at ADB on gender and transport, we've had quite a lot of progress on looking at gender inclusive or women-friendly workplace strategies. So I can think of at least 4 or 5 top of my head of case studies that would be good to point you to. And then when you go through the recommended actions and you click on that, or I think I mentioned it, the organizational structure and capacity excuse me, like the checklist, the box, it'll pop up a list of recommended actions. And I would encourage you to go through it and just make sure, have we considered all these aspects? Again, like I said before, it's not possible to do them all. And the expectation is not that you do them all. But of course, it's just you have that conversation, right? And then you're able to sit through and say, what's possible at this point that we can do? We have the building blocks, some of these things that are very important around having specific policies, making sure we're doing data collection on, sex segregated data on our employees, and at different levels, that we can dig in and better understand what the situation is for women in the workplace and what their specific needs are. Of course, you would complement this, and I'm sure you're doing this with, focus group discussions, key informant interviews, et cetera. But these questions and these actions should help you in those when you are conducting those KIs and FGDs, and to be able to also to refer. Hopefully that would also bolster the case as you're doing this. Sometimes that is very helpful to be able to say, this has been done in perhaps a different part of the country or in different part of the region, and this is how it has worked. Of course, we need to adapt it, but it has worked, and we've seen some great success in putting into place these strategies, and we've seen this impact and how it has been made organizations, have improved decision making or, better results, for example. So I'm hoping that you can use it in that way, but it's very much tailored for a question like yours, actually. So I hope it'll be useful.
Thanks, Claire. The next question, is it appropriate? Now, this is a very, very contentious, this particular one. Is it appropriate in most public transport systems to have women-only carriages?
I think it is an important stopgap measure in specific contexts, right? I think that in some of the contexts that we work in, it is absolutely critical, right? And that is an enabler for women to be able to safely, access mobility, be able to access economic opportunities, health services, et cetera. And we hear it from, when you do surveys and asking women in terms of, what would help them feel safe. It could be, of course, it's not just the women-only carriages. It would be CCTV. It would be having the presence of security personnel on the train, right? So it's never just one action. But of course, we take a step back and we always say the goal is to shift gender norms and social norms, right? So eventually we want to get to the place that we are preventing sexual harassment and gender-based violence from happening in the first place. That is a long-term, hard goal to get to, and we will need temporary measures in place in order to get there. First, to make sure that women are safe, but we must not lose the fact that we should be focusing as well. And that's also something you can find throughout the toolkit of how are we shifting those gender norms? Very hard to do, right? But what are things such as behavioral change campaigns, communication campaigns? I see that's the next question we have in the Q&A, that can help start to shift norms and behaviors and attitudes towards sexual violence, harassment on public transportation, and can look at it from the perspective of whether you are a survivor of that, whether you're a perpetrator, whether you're a bystander, what are things we can do to start mitigating that and preventing that? So it needs to be sort of a two-track solution, in my opinion. And Beck, always would love to also hear your thoughts on this. But I think it's appropriate in short in some contexts, not in others. And it's definitely one step in the longer process that we have to shift gender norms and make it safe for women to be on public transportation.
I fully agree in the importance of context, right? And actually, this brings us to one of the other questions that's in the Q&A box, which is, how does the toolkit, ensure that teams are using context-specific gender actions? Because it does give us, a template, a toolkit with kind of generic actions. So how do we ensure that, that we're getting context-specific actions out of this? And what advice do you give to teams for that?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, I think in terms of urban, for example, versus rural mobility, this is where I highly encourage the filtering, of different, as I mentioned, case studies that would be more applicable to your context, right? But this is why we frame them as guiding questions, because it's definitely not, something that you should be copy pasting and saying this is what would work for me, right? It's meant to spark brainstorming and questions and discussions. It's meant to be that first step for you. And so in having those conversations, and of course, making sure this does not replace a gender assessment. I want to make sure, it is still critical to have a context-specific gender assessment that will take into account these contextual differences that you raise that are so critical, urban versus rural, informal transport, conflict-affected areas, which frankly, like a microsite doesn't have the capacity to be able to get at that level of, granular detail. But you should see it as a companion piece. So to say, okay, this is my initial step that I go to. for brainstorming, for a guiding document. And I will use this paired with and really actually to inform, as I'm thinking about the gender assessment, if I'm a gender specialist or as a transport specialist, as I'm looking at the gender assessment, right, and seeing how it's relevant for the project that I'm working on, that you can really make sure some of these things were covered, that there isn't anything missing, for example, but that the actions need to be guided by your context-specific gender assessment. And what your gender specialist, the person who's there, who's on the ground, is recommending, and after having done conversations and focus group discussions with different stakeholders, right? So it's very much only one piece of the puzzle, but we do hope that it helps you because it demystifies some of this process, as I've said before, that sometimes feels quite tucked away and, all these facts and figures, they're in a bunch of different reports and a bunch of different places. I'm not saying we would still love for you to look at all of those, but we understand people have limited time. And so the hope was really to say, depending on your role, you have, more or less time to look at this. How can we make this process easier, more accessible for you so that you're able to have those conversations and guide this, towards thinking about gender responsive actions in your project?
Yeah, and I think sometimes we all need a little bit of inspiration, right? So if we can go to this very early on and learn from others and then make that our own with the right data, with context, that's a really great thing. So, okay, we don't have a lot of time left. There was what I hope is a quick question. So, do we have any strategies in there in the toolkit about communication strategies and implementing projects, since we know that women and girls access information differently? Are there case studies on this?
We don't, and I would love for you to send in one. Yeah,
Okay.
we don't touch on communication specifically on this. So yeah, that's another area that I would love to, especially as you go through it, the more detail you have of like where you think this would be helpful in the process and specific case studies that you have, we would love to include that. So I would refer back to the contact us link. Please let us know.
Okay. And the last question that we'll have time for today, Claire, do you have recommendations related to social and gender norms around women's access and safe use of vehicles? And would that line of action be conceived from a public-private collaboration approach?
Uh,
So, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking of this from an e-mobility perspective because that's the area where I think we see more of an opening for women to be able to access and use and own vehicles, right? And so and depending on the context, actually, for a lot of the cases where I've seen this in our work, it's been private sector. Gisela works in the private sector, so
Right.
she has to ask this question.
Right.
So I absolutely think that should be, I think that's where the opportunity is, to be honest with you. Not to say that there isn't in sovereign operations, but where we're seeing a lot more around e-mobility and the issues we see around safe access. I mean, what's coming to mind for me is there's a lot of different areas. One is, and we touch upon it briefly in the toolkit, but again, it's an area we'd love to do more on. So again, always welcome to have case studies and more data on this. We think about this from the perspective of if we're thinking about e-vehicles, charging stations, the design of vehicles, which often are not designed to suit women, right? And financing, for example, right? All of these are building blocks to think about how we can have increased access for women and safe use of vehicles. We have a study, this actually isn't in the microsite, but in the toolkit, that looks specifically at women's access to e-scooters and some of the barriers that were associated with that. So I would encourage you to go back and look at that. That is just one case study, and we'd love to include more. But I think there's a little bit that answers your question, more so in the toolkit than in the microsite.
Okay, great. I would love to ask more questions. We had other questions about when we should engage with DMCs using this kind of tool. And I'm going to guess, and please, yes or no, that that's as early as possible. We've spoken about using this for inspiration and as a brainstorming tool, but if there's any other point in the project cycle you think, we should be using this,
Yeah.
where would you see it fitting in?
Yeah, I mean, my answer is always
Yeah,
going to be
but
the, yeah.
country partnership strategy as well. Like,
Yes.
is that another place where this could come in, maybe?
Absolutely. Yes. This tool, thank you for
Yeah.
bringing that up. Yeah, it's not just for that part of the process. You can use it for other processes as well. And there's no reason why you can't as well. I mean, I think when we're thinking about implementation, of course, a lot of times things are already set in stone, but what part of the learnings as well from this project can help inform this, or learnings from implementation. So I'd also encourage, as you get learnings from that we can then start maybe adding something on the microsite that speaks to that more in terms of how do you address specific issues during implementation. This was more focused on the design, but we know that there are issues that come up as well there, right? That we want to have common resources for that people can access. So that might be, like a V2, a version 2 that I can work on.
And I can't help myself. I'm going to ask one more, hopefully quick one. We know sometimes there's a conflict in terms of allocating budget in the project to the gender action plan.
Mhm.
Do we have any case studies in the toolkit about how project teams have effectively allocated budget to implement gender action plans?
We had this conversation during the peer review process of the toolkit, right? And we really struggled with, first of all, even just having a recommendation, because at first we had just a standard, 3 to 5% or an X% of budget should go towards this. And then how do you have that conversation? And we realized that we didn't want to give a recommendation because it is so context specific. That being said, no, we do not have one right now. I would love to, and I'd love to work with you on that, Beck. But if we have people who do have that, please send that in. But that's something that I want to, more of that granularity of some of the very real challenges that come up in this process. I want to make sure that's also included. So that's something that we'll add to the list of additions that I would love to make to the toolkit. So thank you. Thank you for that suggestion.
All right. Thank you, Claire. Look, I am going to have to call it there in terms of the Q&A, but as Claire has highlighted throughout her presentation, if you have other thoughts or comments, there is the Contact Us page on the website under that More Info tab that we can see there on the screen. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our directors, Chen and Sam, for joining us today to set the scene on this important issue and address very openly the gender gap in transportation. So thank you all to all of our fantastic speakers today. Our next webinar will be held on December 12th, and it will be on the topic of designing bankable pathways for transport decarbonisation. The speaker will be Dr. James Dixon. He is the Transport Co-Lead for the Climate Compatible Growth Program and Senior Lecturer at the University of Strathclyde. The session will explore open source modelling tools to translate strategies into investment-ready scenarios that unlock climate financing. So that sounds pretty cool. My name is Rebecca Stapleton. I'm one of the co-team leaders of the ADB Green Road Toolkit Initiative. And I'd just like to say we really appreciate you tuning into our webinars and engaging with us on these important topics. I'd like to remind you that the toolkit is continually evolving, and we also welcome your submission of suggestions or new tools or practices, as well as feedback on our webinar series. And on that note, we'd like to request you to fill in an evaluation form, and we'll share the QR code, which is on the screen now, thank you, so that you can give us feedback or even suggestions for future webinar topics. So with that, I would like to say thank you all for joining us today and for the interactive discussion, and see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.